We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information, it is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur. And Scott, I can't stand this terrible bebop.
Whoa, Cam, can you hear like a low rumble of drums? It's like it's building up to something. Maybe our guest. Oh, a crash of the cymbals. And look who it is. It is Mr. Calvin Dyson making his triumphant return to the show. Hello, Calvin. How are you?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me on. I think with this analogy, it means that I now need to fall over a balcony and die, pretty much. Or scream. I guess I could do that.
Well, apparently the cymbals rocked an American family. So are you going to rock our family?
Oh, I hope so. No, thank you very much for having me back on, because I was on previously when we talked about Goldfinger, and I know that you've done Hitchcock films in the past, and I just practically begged to come on for a Hitchcock discussion at some point. So thank you very much for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back. I mean, I fawned over you having you on the show last time. You know, the Bond guy on YouTube for me. You're the guy I go to for Bond info on YouTube. But you know, now a second time we're like old friends now, so you're just kind of here.
Well, I'd love to know. You know, your specialty is Bond, but obviously there's a lot of connections between Bond and Hitchcock. So where does your history with Hitchcock, go back to?
Oh, well, I guess Hitchcock was sort of what got me interested in film, beyond just bits of entertainment, like watching his films. Like The Birds was the first film that I remember watching at 10, 11 years old, something like that, where I was really like, oh, wow, I really want to know what this is about. And the way that film ends was kind of my introduction to film theory, reading about why it ends in such a way, and then also just behind the scenes technicalities and all that kind of stuff, how the films are actually made. So it was really kind of Hitchcock that got me interested in filmmaking in those senses. So and then, as you say, there's a lot of connections with Bond. Hitchcock was obviously one of the top choices, I think, back in when they were starting the series with Dr. No to potentially direct and whatnot. And indeed, he has so many spy and espionage films in his filmography. It feels like it would have been a real fit that would have really made sense. Except that for the most part, Hitchcock, even in his spy films, they're about everyday people getting swept up in extraordinary situations, whereas James Bond is very much an extraordinary man in extraordinary situations. So I think that's where the disconnect is. But no, I'm a massive fan, so I'm very happy and grateful to be here talking about this film, so thank you.
Well, on your YouTube channel, which I briefly referenced before, you've done a couple of Hitchcock reviews.
Yes.
Have you tackled any of the two versions of this film we're talking about today?
No, actually. So this was a really good excuse to revisit both of them. I was just saying before we started recording, I really enjoyed your guys' episode on the original film, and I don't want to repeat too much of what you already said there, because I pretty much just agreed with everything that you said there, including your. I detected a slight hesitancy at not allowing it on the knock list, but I do agree with you. I don't think it's almost there, but it's just not quite on it.
It's one of those things with Hitchcock where you tend to want to come down on a yes because of his legacy and how pretty much almost every one of his movies that we'd be covering is fairly iconic. But you then have to divide which of the must-sees versus which of the ones you should check out after you've seen the must-sees.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you did mention a couple of films before, but maybe before we talk about this film in particular, what are some of your other favorite Hitchcock films?
Oh, well, Psycho is like I would cite that as my favorite film ever. I love that thing so much. It's perfect, even with its flaws. if a flawed thing can be perfect. Rear Window is another one. Strangers on a Train, North by Northwest. Vertigo has really. I remember seeing that for the first time as a 11-year-old, whatever, and it having no effect on me whatsoever. And then growing up, I was like, oh my god, no, this is amazing. And now it's just one of my very favorite films. But I am also a huge fan of his 30s filmography, like before he went to America. So things like The Lady Vanishes, 39 Steps, of course. Sabotage, I really like. Young and Innocent, I really like. And yeah, the original Man Who Knew Too Much is very much in that bracket. I always kind of think of it as being of that quality. I think that those films are just slightly better than it. I mean, I think 39 Steps is just, yeah, superb piece of work. Lady Vanishes too.
Especially when you take into account that there's like a 1-year difference between Man Who Knew Too Much and 39 Steps. It's like just the leaps and bounds between those two is very significant.
Crazy, isn't it? Yeah, it's fascinating seeing him in that era where he's clearly finding his groove and picking up a lot of the techniques and stories, to be honest, that he'll explore much better later on down the line. And The Man Who Knew Too Much is so interesting because it's the most overt example of that, where he's literally like remaking the film, which is really interesting. It's kind of impossible not to compare the two, really, when you're watching either of them.
Well, I think we've waltzed around it, Cam, but what are we talking about this week?
We are talking about the 1956 version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring James Stewart and Doris Day.
Now, a lot of you will probably know the premise of this film. You might have seen the original version or the remake version, but for those who haven't seen anything, here is your letterboxd.com synopsis. And oh boy, I've just opened the page. Settle in, folks. The Man Who Knew Too Much. A little knowledge can be a deadly thing. A widescreen Technicolor remake by Hitchcock of his 1934 film of the same title. A couple vacationing in Morocco with their young son accidentally stumble upon an assassination plot. When the child is kidnapped to ensure their silence, they have to take matters into their own hands to save him.
Yeah.
It's a bit wordy for me, but
I like the VistaVision part. That was what really grabbed me.
Yeah, really important for a synopsis, isn't it? To know how it's been presented.
I need to know that it was done in a color format that I approve of.
Well, usually at this point when we have a guest joining for like a remake, I would ask Calvin. I'd ask you what you thought of the original, but you sort of said before. But any other thoughts about the original version you want to talk about now?
Yeah, sorry, I sort of jumped the gun a bit there.
That's fine.
No, I think I'm sort of too much in agreement with your previous review on it to have any kind of original thoughts to say of my own, I suppose. I know that Hitchcock's quote about this, I think you might have even said this in your previous episode, that he felt that the original film was made by a talented amateur, whereas the remake was made by a professional. And I think that sums it up. I think you go to that original film and you can see a lot of the things that he will experiment with and do better later on. It's kind of a blueprint in a lot of ways. I do think that there are a couple of things that it does a bit better than this remake, and I guess we'll get into talking about those as we go on. Yeah, but maybe I'll save that for a little bit later.
We'll come back to that, but I, as usual, have never seen this film until watching it for this podcast, so I have nothing to add at this stage because I just never seen anything, apparently. But Cam, what about you? When did you first see this film?
I watched this one back when I was doing a run through a lot of the Hitchcock movies I hadn't seen. Like, when I started, I watched the obvious ones like Psycho and The Birds and North by Northwest, but I think it was when I picked up the Hitchcock, I can't remember which box set it was. The signature one, I think. The one with the red felt on it. And it came with, like, a massive collection of them. And I had also picked up a cheap DVD of the original. And I know I watched the original first and followed it up, I think maybe even, like, a day or two later with the remake, which was actually a mistake because it kind of robbed it of some of its, surprises. I was finding myself more in that mental exercise of just tracking where it was diverting and where it was sticking to the actual plot. So I wouldn't say the first time through was a great experience, especially when I was also watching things like Rear Window and, some of these other classics I was, watching for the first time or revisiting in that box set and going, well, I don't know, Men Who Knew Too Much, not quite up to snuff with those, but it is one that over the years, my opinion has very much changed as I've separated myself from that experience of just watching the two of them back to back.
And what about you, Calvin? Any thoughts, memories of your first experience seeing this film?
Well, similar to Cam, like it's part of that Universal Studios collection of the Hitchcock films, though it was originally a Paramount film, and I believe along with several of the others like Rear Window, Trouble with Harry, Hitchcock made them at Paramount, but it was a contractual thing that eventually the rights reverted to the family, and then I think Universal bought them or licensed them or something from the Hitchcock family, and so it's included in all of their box sets now, even though it does begin with the Paramount picture in VistaVision at the start of it. I remember watching it. I must have been 11, 12 years old, around about that time, for the remake, for the American one, because I was working my way through these Universal Hitchcock DVDs. The original one I didn't see for a good while afterwards, and a part of that was partly as Cam alluded to, is that some of those early Hitchcock films had really bad DVD transfers because they're so old, and I don't know if it's public domain exactly, but there were a lot of really cheap, nasty DVD transfers of those early films out there. Now it's brilliant. Now I think in the States you can get it on Criterion Collection with beautiful restoration and all that kind of stuff. Here in the UK it has a very nice Blu-ray transfer as well. So I kind of waited until I was, even at that young an age, I was a bit of a stickler for what video quality my 1934 entertainment came in. So I kind of waited for that. And yeah, maybe then I was too familiar with the remake to appreciate it on its own terms. Sometimes I kind of wish maybe I'd seen the original first, but so this one goes back to my childhood. My mum was a massive Doris Day fan, so that is very much at the forefront of my mind watching it with her. She had the whole Doris Day DVD collection and whatnot. What about you, Scott?
Well, I mean, to your point there, Calvin, and it's interesting to parallel with Cam there, because Cam saw them both in a row, the original and the remake. Calvin, you saw it the other way around and kind of judged it that way. I am watching them, I suppose, sequentially, but there's been about 2 months in between. But that is one thing I did struggle with, and I think we'll get into in the review, is trying to separate the two films almost. It's like they imprint on each other because they are basically the same film with a few differences. But Cam, why did it get remade?
Well, it's kind of a long, convoluted story, but producer David O. Selznick bought the rights to the original in 1941 and was urging Hitchcock to make a U.S. version. And Hitchcock just had no new spin on the material. He was like, I just did this a handful of years ago. I'm not that interested. And it wasn't until, in the 50s, Hitchcock went on a 28th anniversary trip with his wife, Alma, and they made a detour to Morocco, and he suddenly had the idea of a family on vacation in Morocco and the child getting kidnapped, and basically spinning off into what would kind of be the inspiration for the movie. And it was going to originally have a different title. They were going to, I think, work with the title Into Thin Air, which may be a little catchy. I don't know. I kind of like that. But it's so samey that then you fall into that Thunderball versus Never Say Never Again thing, where people watch Never Say Never Again and are like, wait a second.
Okay, so it's interesting that he was kind of resistant to the idea of doing a remake and then caved in when he had a concept in mind, but then also didn't want to call it the same thing. Would that Into Thin Air have been so close of a remake, or would he maybe have tried to separate them a little bit?
My guess is it probably would have been pretty similar, but I also just wonder if you're making the US version in, those days, you'd probably assume that a lot of people wouldn't have even watched the 1930s British version.
Well, how did it, I mean, you'll be the expert. Actually, you both would be the expert on this one. How did it work at that point? If the British version, I imagine, got played in North America, there's been 20 years in between. Obviously, there's no home video. So unless you caught it in theaters, you had never seen the original, basically.
Yeah, and I can't imagine they would have been doing a lot of revival screenings of like a 1934 British film.
Yeah, precisely. I think so I guess we think of remakes as being like quite a modern Hollywood thing, but it was very common back. I mean, the Judy Garland Wizard of Oz was like what, the third or fourth screen version of that story, like that. But obviously, we remember the iconic one. By this point, one of Hitchcock's earlier silent films, The Lodger, had been remade. Not by Hitchcock himself, but it did star Ivor Novello, the original actor who was in the Lodger. So remakes were a very quite common thing. It was a good way of cashing, brand recognition in a way for people who might remember the old thing, but then also retooling it for a different audience if necessary. And I know that this film was part of Hitchcock, owed Paramount Pictures a film in the contract, and so this one was kind of we can do this. We can dust this off. It's the kind of ready-made concept.
Yeah, and it was his follow-up to The Trouble with Harry, which was sort of a curious black comedy that he made that didn't really take the world by storm. It's an interesting film to watch. I don't know, for a comedy, I find it a little too leisurely. Calvin, are you a fan of that one?
Oh, I'm not a fan, in as much as, I'll happily watch any Hitchcock film, but no, I'm very similar with that. It is a comedy, but it's so dry, and so it is a dark comedy. It's about a dead body and all that kind of stuff, but it's the pacing of the humor is so it takes a long time, and I think it feels a lot longer than it is. I think it might only be 100 minutes long, but it feels like it's 2 hours plus. Good cast.
I'm just trying to picture an Alfred Hitchcock version of Weekend at Bernie's.
Basically, in some ways, they're not carrying around a body at parties all weekend, but it's kind of playing with similar kind of idea. I actually saw that one. I mean, I'd seen it a couple times, but I went to a 24-hour film festival. They do it in Art House Theater here in Vancouver, and they'll program just a long run of movies, and they'll usually work in a Hitchcock. They closed one of the 24-hour film festivals with Rear Window, for example. But I remember it popped up that they were doing The Trouble with Harry, and everyone kind of got excited because it's a Hitchcock movie, and you could feel the energy just kind of die over the next 2 hours as people are on movie number, I don't know, 7 or 8 at that point, and it's this is not the Hitchcock I was hoping for or anticipating, this many hours in.
It is one of those where you feel like he's really getting something out of his system with it, every now and then, you'll with an author, for instance, Ian Fleming, just to bring it back to Bond, him writing The Spy Who Loved Me, which is a Bond novel entirely from a female protagonist perspective. And sometimes you just get the sense that the artist just needs to get this out of their system and then they can move on. And in a way, I feel like The Man Who Knew Too Much remake is of a similar vein, really. It feels like, oh, okay, I need to get back on track, and this is a tried and tested formula that I know works, so let's hop back on that. Because it is curious that he remade this. He never remade 39 Steps, or in as much as, using the same title again. As I say, there's a lot of thematic and plot similarities in so much of his stuff, particularly the spy stuff. But this is the only one that he went back and used the title on, so he must have felt some kind of affinity towards it.
That was going to be my follow-up question, was why was this the only one that he officially remade? But I guess it's more just we'll never know.
I wonder if it was also just a concept he didn't feel like he hit a home run with the first time, versus I don't know that he felt a great urgency to remake the 39 Steps, for example, which was a hugely acclaimed movie.
He probably heard our review and just thought, no, I didn't nail it the first time. Let's do it again.
Sure, yeah. He's a time traveler.
Yeah. Well.
So they were taking the original story of the 1934 version, which was done by Charles Bennett and D.B. Wyndham Lewis, and Hitchcock initially brought in the writer of the movie Spellbound, one of his previous films, Angus MacPhail, to work on the script for this remake. And at a certain point, they had just kind of a bit of a separation, and he brought in John Michael Hayes, who had begun working in TV in 1951 before jumping over in 54 to do Rear Window, and he would also do To Catch a Thief and The Trouble with Harry. So he had kind of a streak with Hitchcock here. And this would be the final one they do together, and that's because while he has the sole credit on this movie, there was actually a bit of a battle because Angus MacPhail felt he contributed quite significantly. Hitchcock apparently put both men's names forward as who he thought the writer of the film was, and this really made John Michael Hayes angry, and it caused a rift between the two, and they never worked together again. So, interesting case, and I would be very interested to know in like the year 2022, if you had a situation like this, I think Angus MacPhail would probably be getting credit.
Well, I mean, how does it work now? Isn't it like a percentage thing? You have to write a percentage of the script to have a credit, but you can also have a story by credit. I don't know how that works. Maybe he'd have that.
Yeah, you'd have to have a certain percentage, but like MacPhail has argued, like he was even writing scenes during production as well. So that's where it gets pretty iffy. Like a lot of movies nowadays, you might have a whole group of writers that aren't credited because they just did little punch-up bits on set. But generally, if you had two major talents like this working back and forth on elements of it, you'd have both. I think of when we interviewed John August, and I brought up Dark Shadows, which turned out to be a very unpleasant memory from his past I did not know about. But he has a story credit on that film, and it was because his original draft was just completely rewritten. Versus, yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe that's just something to do with the guilds. I don't know if they were they around at this point, all the writers' guilds and stuff.
Yeah, it was called the Screenwriters Guild at that point, not the Writers Guild of America. But
Right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So the production for this one was actually quite complex. It went 37 days over schedule, including 6 shutdown days, and they went over budget. And that was largely because while they were shooting in Morocco, riots broke out between the people of Morocco versus the French protectorate that were ruling the country. And the production department managed to get out of there just days before the French administrator was assassinated. So, some pretty tense circumstances going on around the filming of these tense circumstances.
It's interesting because I had a lot of trouble telling where they were actually shooting in Morocco compared to it being like a backdrop screen, rear projection, and just on a set somewhere. It didn't feel like they were actually there that long.
They were there long enough.
Yeah, I think Hitchcock and the principal actors were there for a very short time, and then I think it was the assistant director or the associate producer, Herbert Coleman, who stayed behind with like a second unit to get all of like the shots of the coach coming in and background plates and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, this is a pet peeve of mine with Hitchcock, like his reluctance to do too much on location, and I think there is an over-reliance on studio shot back, like really obvious back projection. And in this one it's particularly frustrating because you know that they were there in the location. Doris Day and James Stewart were actually there, but then they have, and they'll just have a shot where the two of them are walking down past a load of market stalls, and then it'll cut just a bit closer in, and then all of a sudden they're in the studio and it's the back projection going, and it takes me out of it a bit, which is a shame because I think it's quite a interesting location and not one that you really like. Hitchcock famously didn't like location shooting all that much at all. So to see him in such a different kind of place from his usual, US, UK settings is interesting. I hear it was the only time on set he ever wore anything other than like a shirt and a suit and tie. Apparently he was turning up in a short sleeve t-shirt, much to his own chagrin, apparently. Oh, and Doris Day hated the food is another thing that I saw in my research. In the film, it's played kind of like James Stewart is the sort of the cultural rube, as it were, who doesn't really know much about the other culture or and whatnot. Whereas in reality, apparently, it was Doris Day who was very very much wanting her home comforts.
It does cause that weird sort of mental effect when you're watching the movie because they're there. Like you can see these actors are in Morocco, and then you'll have a shot of them like in a carriage or whatever, and the background is clearly a plate, and you're like, I don't understand. I know they're in Morocco. Why does it look like this?
It was all the stuff with the acrobats and the bazaar. I just thought, pretty sure that was what was happening in there anyway. You could have just had them stand next to it and say a few lines. But
yeah,
I don't make films.
Hitchcock said that he didn't like if you film it on location, you need to do the voice, the ADR, the looping afterwards, because you can't really use the sound on location. And apparently he didn't like doing that so much. I think it's it doesn't make much of a difference for me personally, but I guess for his own taste.
He is Alfred Hitchcock. I guess I can't argue with him too much.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. So the movie had a budget of $1.8 million. Domestically, it did 11.3. International, we're talking about a 1950s release, so it's very hard to track that sort of stuff down. But either way, that's a pretty good multiplier on your initial investment, even though it did, go over budget.
Do you happen to have? It's going to be the first of our times comparing, but the budget for the original.
Oh, I can't remember. It was like something like £80,000 or something. That number's jumping to my mind. Yeah.
It was £5. Yeah, sure, something like that. Okay, fine. Threadbare. I understand. Okay. Right, this is definitely the Hollywood version. Understood.
Yeah, it was definitely cheap. So the top 3 for this year, number 1 was The 10 Commandments, number 2 was Around the World in 80 Days, and number 3 was Giant. Those are 3 very big movies. This speaks to the era of, we're heading towards that period in the 60s where they would bloat everything out, and they would almost crush Hollywood with all these massive spectacles, and we're at that point where it's building towards that. When you look at those top 3, those are all 3 very long films.
Did you say that the third film was called Giant, and it was some very big films?
That is correct. I did say that.
Wow. You really wanted that laugh there, didn't you?
I did. And it was delayed, but I got there. And Around the World in 80 Days won the Oscar that year. I think it's probably one of the worst Oscar winners of all time. It's really rough. Really rough.
Was this at the time where things like 20th Century Fox were just, bribing the Academy members to vote for their things, or was that? I know they definitely did that with the Rex Harrison Dr. Dolittle, but that was probably about 10 years after this.
Yeah, I think it was probably just a year of when they were really going for big star stuff. So it's like you have 37 stars showing up in that movie, and it was big and expensive, and they were like, how could we not give this the best picture? But you watch it now, it's torture.
Wait, so there was a Dr. Dolittle film that was bad and didn't have Robert Downey Jr. in it?
There have been 2 previous ones that didn't have Robert Downey Jr. in it that were bad.
3. There's the sequel to the Eddie Murphy one.
Oh God, yes, you're right.
Wait, are you saying the first Eddie Murphy one was bad?
Oh, is this controversial?
Oh, okay. I'm alone here in my Eddie Murphy fandom. Okay, that's fine. Moving swiftly on.
Yes. So a couple other notes just to wrap up this stuff. The movie was a hit. It landed in the top 10 for that year. Exact placement, again, we're dealing with the 1950s, so it gets a little muddy. But the film did win 1 Oscar, and it was nominated for 1 for Best Song for Whatever Will Be, Que Sera Sera. And it became like a real standard for Doris Day, and she would perform it in 2 more movies. She performed it in the 1960 film Please Don't Eat the Daisies, which I have not seen, as well as 1966's The Glass-Bottomed Boat, which is a spy movie, so it means we'll be tackling it on this show further down the road.
I get to hear the song again. That's nice. I like that.
Yeah, and apparently the song was inspired by the movie The Barefoot Contessa, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ava Gardner, which I haven't seen. I have it on my shelf, so I need to check that out and see if I can spot the connections.
I spent too much time looking up this song today, finding out that it won an Oscar and such. But it's a mistranslation as well, which I quite like. It's a literal translation from Whatever Will Be. If you actually translate that into I think what language is it trying to be? Is it Spanish?
Is it French?
Now you got me wondering. But either way, it doesn't work, and it doesn't come out. It's not even particularly melodic. So they just made it a melodic thing, which is nice though. It's been stuck in my head for about 2 days since I first watched this film.
Oh, okay. And so I mentioned that Hitch would not work again with the writer John Michael Hayes, but he did work that same year again moving forward with Angus MacPhail. They did 1956's The Wrong Man, which was Hitch's really only real true story kind of biopic film with Henry Fonda. Pretty solid. I think it's a good movie. And Calvin mentioned it earlier about The Man Who Knew Too Much kind of being out of circulation for a while. It was one of the 5. Vertigo was also another one. And also Rope, The Trouble with Harry, and Rear Window. The 5 of them wound up in sort of this deal where it was Hitch's production company breaking apart from the studio, and the movies were pulled from circulation in the 1960s, and it was largely because of TV airings that caused a breach of contract between the 2 over copyright. And so it wasn't until 1984 that they were re-released. So there was like 20 plus years where those 5 movies were not in circulation.
That's interesting. I didn't realize it was as a result of TV airings. That's that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because I would imagine when they put that contract together, and it was an 8-year contract, I believe, between Hitchcock and Paramount, that you wouldn't have seen TV necessarily being as big a thing as it would be by the end of that contract.
Well, I think we've gone into we've got to the point now where we need to talk about this film, and I am very curious to know what we all think about it in 2022. So let's all grab our swordfish and take shots at each other. That scene is bizarre, but Calvin, you're our guest. You go first. What do you think of The Man Who Knew Too Much, version 2?
Sure. I'm actually quite a big fan of this one. I appreciate that it might be a bit. It doesn't have the notoriety or the special shine of a Vertigo or a North by Northwest or a Rear Window. It is kind of it's potboiler sort of Hitchcock stuff, I guess. But it's I really like it. I always enjoy watching it. And I think a big part of that is down to the leads. I love James Stewart and Doris Day as the leads of this. I think there's some really standout set pieces throughout. I think even something as simple as James Stewart walking down a little snicket when he's on his way to the taxidermist. All that is just him walking down this tiny little alleyway. You don't even really know if there's any danger coming. You just know that there's another guy around in the vicinity somewhere. But it's to generate suspense out of that moment's really great. I love the whole Albert Hall sequence. Is just I think when you see that, you're kind of like, oh, maybe this is exactly why he wanted to remake this scene, because it is so expertly constructed, and I love the music all the way through it. I think it's brilliant. It doesn't have a signature standout villain like Peter Lorre from the original one, I don't think. I think it kind of suffers a bit from that. I also think it maybe suffers from replacing the big like bloodbath shootout of the original with James Stewart pushing a man down some stairs. Like, it doesn't quite work as the same climax. But even in spite of those things, I think it's I think it's, to go back to Hitchcock's own quote about it, you really do feel like this is a professional filmmaker crafting this. There is another quote from him on this film where he was asked to kind of elaborate on that, and he said that the difference would be that in the original Man Who Knew Too Much, I wasn't audience conscious, whereas in the second one I was. And I think that really shows in this one. I feel like in the original the characters are kind of ciphers, really. I don't think of Edna Best and Leslie Banks in that film as, if you ask me to describe them in an adjective, I don't know if I could with those characters. They are just kind of vessels to kind of get us through all of these situations. Here, I feel like you do have your audience surrogate quite firmly in those two lead characters. I think they're much more improved. Sorry, I could wax lyrical for some more, but I'm curious to know how you two feel about it.
Well, I was going to say, I really feel robbed of not having Doris Day pull out a shotgun at the end and snipe someone off a roof.
Right? What a missed opportunity. I love that bit about the first one.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like they're playing to the strengths of the actress there, where, I mean, they obviously gave the wife the gimmick that she was a really good shooter in the first one, whereas here it's like Doris Day is such an amazing singer. They're like, okay, we've got to tie that into the finale versus her pulling out a shotgun, which she could have done both. That's how you, like, end the song.
I would pay for the version of the film where during the song she stops and then pulls a shotgun out of the piano and shoots someone. That's what I want to see.
Oh my God.
That's the 2022 remake version, I think, actually.
Oh, if only. So for me, this one is one that I don't think it like reaches the heights of the movies around it. Like when you're talking about like Rear Window or Vertigo, like those are all-time masterpieces. But I think this one is just a really, really absorbing, both travelogue in Morocco. I really do enjoy a lot of that stuff. But also just in terms of the overall caper, it feels a lot more well thought out from a character dynamic than the original did. Because the original, we talked about, when you get to that things like the shootout and stuff, they don't even know what to do with the lead characters anymore. They're like, just shuffle them off screen and let the police take over here. Whereas it feels like this one was very much written from the point of view of follow our characters, give them things to do, make Doris Day a very active character within the story. Because, I mean, her child's been kidnapped. It makes sense for her to want to, resolve this mystery and get him back. Whereas in the original, the wife just kind of sat at home a lot, which could be, the differences maybe in how women were portrayed in film, the 30s versus the 50s, and gender roles, and the expectations of an audience. But it's just much more satisfying here because you're seeing two superstars do amazing work together in the film. And so for me, like, it has just those memorable set pieces I enjoy, and just from the craftsmanship stuff, it's Hitchcock really knowing how to put one of these movies together. I don't know that he would, at the end of his life, have put this in his all-time great passion projects, but I think it's one he makes incredibly well, and you can see the ways that it would connect well to like a North by Northwest in his career trajectory.
Do you know, it's strange. I was really curious to know what you both would think about this film. I'm glad I'm going last because I'm not such a fan.
Oh, voice of dissent.
Ooh,
I'm not trying to.
nice.
I'm not trying to give a hot take. It's none of that. It's just. I think one of the problems I had, and I will preface with this, I had trouble distinguishing the films. I had seen the two of them within 2 months of each other. And I spent a lot of time analyzing the first one, and then I had to analyze this one a lot. And so I'm sitting there. The first time around I watched it, I sat there sort of plotting and going, okay, well, this is their version of that, and da-da-da-da-da-da, and that's what they've changed in this film. The second time I watched it today, I put that to one side, and I thought, let's just take it for a film. Let's pretend like I hadn't seen the original, which is what I imagine most audiences that saw it the year it came out felt the same way. And I think it's probably the definitive version of this story, but I think it's maybe just not as interesting. It's almost too glossy for me. Not only is perhaps a little bit long compared to the first one, I just think it does so many things right. I don't want to like beat up the film. There's lots of things I like. I love James Stewart and Doris Day. I think they're the best things in this film. But I think it is, as Calvin said, lacking that Peter Lorre actual villain to get the real sort of sense of tension and fear that the original version really has. And so I spent a lot of time sort of watching James Stewart walk around the streets of Brixton trying to figure out what's going on, which is lovely to see old Brixton. I really like that. But I don't know. I just didn't get as connected. But then it's strange. In the beginning, it's really fun. And then there's a middle act where I just found it to be not particularly interesting. And then as soon as we get back to the Royal Albert Hall, and Cam, you know how much I love the Royal Albert Hall.
Of course.
I can't wait to kick you down those stairs. I loved seeing that, and Calvin's right. I think it's it's wonderfully put together. I think it's interesting. I think it goes for like 12 minutes with no talking, just the music playing, and I don't think many films could pull that off, and this film does. Credit where it's due. And I love the stuff in the embassy afterwards because I really liked Doris Day. I think it's really nice to see a strong female character that has strength in being a mother, and the film doesn't dismiss it. There is strength in that, and it should be celebrated. And that is what ultimately saves the day, is that connection she has with her son and the singing that's set up at the beginning, paid off at the end. Wonderful stuff. I mean, and I love the escape from the embassy. Yes, I wouldn't have minded the shotgun in the piano, but that stuff's great. But for me, I just think the middle bit really weighs it down. I was disappointed. I was quite excited going into it, and I think I was disappointed with the result.
Oh, interesting.
We talked about North by Northwest, quite a while back now in the run of the show, but of this era, like, for you, is there like a big difference between the two in terms of Hitchcock espionage stories?
I think North by Northwest is just a lot pacier. It just seems to be quicker on its feet. It didn't seem to have a moment for you to really sort of sit and dwell. And that's a good thing in my book when it comes to these type of spy films. This isn't trying to be a Cold War story. Now, go on, Calvin.
Oh, no. I just, to your point there, I do agree with you. There is that scene in this film where James Stewart goes to the taxidermist, which is just a complete red herring, pointless tangent that, as I say, I really love that sequence kind of building to it, where he's waiting around on the streets and you can hear the footsteps coming and going, all that kind of stuff I think is really lovely. But does nothing
Yeah.
plot-wise, and then it becomes so broadly comedic when the guy's sort of faffing around with the swordfish, and it's a little bit too choreographed. You can see that the guy is no real person in that scenario would handle the swordfish in that manner, where the blade is constantly going at James Stewart's throat because they don't actually have any intent on harming him. It's just a big misunderstanding. But I do agree that in that middle section, once they arrive back in the UK to the Albert Hall sequence, I do appreciate that there is a lull there for sure.
And I just think, like, I'm not going to sit here and compare it just yet. I think maybe we'll do a little bit of that towards the end. I think that's probably half of my problem. I was coming into this from the people on Twitter that I spoke to, other fans of Hitchcock films, even Cam, that this was the definitive version. And I was like, this is going to be a smash hit. I cannot wait to find a film that goes up against North by Northwest. And it doesn't quite get there for me. I think maybe that's where my disappointment comes. Not to say that it's a bad film. I just perhaps had my expectations too high.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, that scene with the I think the scene with the it's not, I don't think it's a swordfish, it's a sawfish, I think. We used to have one in our aquarium because it has like the saw blade protruding from the nose or whatever it's called. I'm not a fish person.
How big was this aquarium? Things like
It's big. They had like a huge tank of sharks, and there was one of those swimming around too, and I loved it as a kid. But that whole sequence, it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. It is like a total, mislead. Like, it looks kind of sinister. You've got those taxidermied animals that are all looking like they're going to pounce. You've got the tiger that is portrayed in a very threatening way, facing towards Stewart, which I have to wonder if that led into Psycho with the birds of prey hanging up over Marion Crane in that scene. It feels like Hitchcock loved to revisit his motifs, and that feels like it may have evolved from there. But I think I enjoyed it more on the rewatch, and I think I would have agreed with you, Scott, the first time I saw this movie, going, like, why is that scene there? Like, this is unnecessary, and I feel like I'm just, it's wasted shoe leather of a character walking around. On the revisit, I feel like it's kind of like a comedy highlight for me, where it's just so ridiculous, and that's kind of what I find funny about it. When James Stewart's getting his hand stuck in the tiger's mouth, the guy is walking around with that sawfish. I don't know, like, it just feels like a scene that in a different movie he would have shown up. You would have had all these like threatening, like animals around him and kind of scary looking dudes, and it would have led somewhere. And the fact it's kind of played as a joke is kind of the novelty of it. But it does nothing for pace. I will admit that for sure.
And there's also like, it's not just that sequence. There's a couple of other things I think in that middle section that hold it back. There's that they turn up at the hotel in London, and a random set of friends turn up and have a chat and drink their booze and eat the room service at James Stewart's.
I quite like that.
Oh, you like that? Okay,
Yeah,
that's fine.
that.
That's fine.
Yeah, that made me laugh. There was, and occasionally when they cut back to them and they're
Slightly
just
getting more.
completely oblivious.
It's
like Doris
drunk as
Day's
the film goes on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just her showbiz mates that have turned up randomly. But I quite like the stuff with them.
Well, I won't dwell on my problems just yet. Let's talk about things that we did enjoy. So, Calvin, something you really liked about the film.
Something I really liked. Well, I guess the leads, again, just to talk about them, because I think it is so central for a lot of the love that I do have for the film, that they do feel like, yes, they're movie stars, it's James Stewart and Doris Day, but they feel like a real couple. Like, so often in Hitchcock films we see the start of a romantic relationship or whatnot, particularly in these kinds of spy films. Generally, the two protagonists don't know each other prior to the start of the thing. In this one, they're a married couple, and they clearly, they'll make the occasional little snide remark to each other. At one point, I think Doris Day says, "Oh, is this our, time for our monthly row," sort of thing. You get the sense that it's not really, I think it's kind of subtext stuff about how she had to give up her career as a popular singer to kind of settle in the middle of nowhere with him, because he just kind of likes the quieter pace of life, and he's a doctor. He likes his small town patients. A couple of points, I think characters are like, well, why don't you just move to New York or London or somewhere a bit more glamorous? But he doesn't want any of it. And I like that there is just that little bit of resentment there. There is something bubbling there. So yeah, there's I think one of the standout dramatic scene really is the scene where James Stewart is gearing up to tell his wife that their son's been kidnapped, and he's gonna give her these sedatives. He's a doctor; he has all of these pills with him, and he's not really telling her what they're for at this point. He just wants to like calm her down because he knows that she's gonna freak out, and it's I think it's good because it doesn't condone what he's doing. I think he's clearly like really like, oh god, you can tell that he's feeling really bad in himself about having to do this, and he knows what's coming, and I think she acts the hell out of it. I think she is absolutely phenomenal in that, Doris Day. I think she's interesting as well because she Hitchcock obviously notable for blonde leading ladies in his films, and they're so often sexualized. I don't feel like Doris Day's character here is that much, even though she is very much of that look that he clearly his type. We see it time and time again. Madeline Carroll, Tippi Hedren, Grace Kelly, and indeed he did apparently want Grace Kelly for the lead in this, but I think it was he and Doris Day shared the same agents and James Stewart, MCA, and they said, well, we'll give you James Stewart, but you need to also take Doris Day as well for this. So she wasn't necessarily his first choice. And I do wonder how much of the fact that the character is a mother, and it's just Hitchcock's inability to sexualize a mother figure, that she doesn't come across as terribly... I mean, this is just my interpretation, and, correct me if you interpreted it differently, but I feel like she's very much, even though she has that look, she has the Edith Head costumes, the grey suits that he loves to dress actresses in his films. I don't feel like she is terribly sexualized in this. She feels like a mother in a weird way, and I don't know if that's a conscious thing on his part, like he just can't sexualize a mother figure, or whether it's the Doris Day squeaky clean persona that's just I'm too familiar with that to kind of see her in a more seductive role, I guess. I don't really know.
Well, I guess it must just be me, because the mother chain smoking and Notorious just did it for me. I've got to say, like, puffing away in that bed. I mean, wow, look at her go. I'll talk to the mother point first. I think you're right though, Calvin. I think he isn't sexualizing his lead female. I think it's to the better of the film, because much as James Stewart is kind of our protagonist, it is the both of them, but really, if you look at what's achieved, it's mostly her that actually achieves getting their son back. He maybe physically does it, but it's her singing. You go back further, she's the one who sort of goes to the church first. All sort of leads back there. And then sort of going back to, you mentioned the scene together, that sort of where they have their monthly argument, and he tells her about the kidnapping. I'm not going to say I really dug him giving her pills, but more of a case of, I like the concept of, in his moment of crisis, he goes back to what he's been trained, and that's medicine. And so he's like, okay, I need to calm the patient down, and I can give her the bad news. And it just goes very clinical. It's not something that's really overtly said, but that's how I interpreted it.
That's actually a really good read of people going back to what they do best, because the way that she goes to singing at the end to save the day as well, and the way they deal with like a traumatic situation. It's a scene that, like, you would not have this scene in a movie now. They would not have the husband character drugging the wife at all. But, Scott, you and I guested on the Is Paul Dano Okay podcast recently, where Cameron Diaz is drugged like 3 times over the course of Night and Day. And it was done for a comedy back in, 2010, not that long ago.
2010, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the reason that scene works for me is, as you said, like, Jimmy Stewart seems very tortured when he's doing it, but also, like, it's not like he gives her the pills and the next day it's just like, well, everything's okay. You see that, like, she's carrying the pain of this moment and the anguish of it for a long stretch of the film, which in the original, that kid went missing and they're like, well, cheerio. What do you do?
What was his first words when he got his daughter at the end? Where'd you get those pajamas from?
Yeah, like, there's a level of psychological, I think, realism going on here that I appreciated, because it doesn't, as much as the movie is a little bit of that fizzy, in some ways kind of romantic comedy caper, it takes its moments of drama seriously, and I think that's a really good one. And also, probably elevates the movie because you have scenes like that. And I really, really liked how Doris Day, off the bat, was just like figuring out everything that's going on. She's like, hey, you're giving all this information to Bernard. He didn't tell you anything about himself. And he's like, oh, you're crazy. And that happens several times. The people were watching her outside the hotel. She's the one that's clocking everything that's going on. And I wonder how much of that is the fact that we get it. He's from Indiana. He's this kind of small town doctor. She is an international recording star who is used to traveling the world and having more of a sense of what's going on around her. And it's never underlined. They're never having moments where she explains this to the audience, but it feels like there's a lot being written into that character and portrayed on screen that you can really read into, which is, to me, a sign of a movie that's just genuinely interesting, because I don't know that I could read that much into either, lead in the original.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think like how the different characters are reacting to the Louis Bernard character as well. It's in the original, you think Edna Best she's kind of flirting with him. Like, I think she is quite sexualized in that film. And you're sort of wondering what her angle is in that film. The character motivations are quite unclear, I think. Yeah, in that film, you're like, is she angling for some sort of threesome going on? Like, what's her deal with this? She's very flirty with this man for no reason. Whereas here, Doris Day is just naturally, quite suspicious about what's going on. She's a good judge of character, which is, more interesting for a thriller like this.
I wonder if the lack of sexualization with her character also could be, the Doris Day factor is huge. She's a massive star and she's known for this squeaky clean image, but also this is the 1950s and it's a very conservative period in film. And I would have to imagine if you're making a major studio film where you have like a all-American small town family together, you're not going to be really portraying the wife in that kind of light.
Yeah, completely. It's not like Grace Kelly in Rear Window where she's kind of like a New York fashion sort of designer, socialite kind of thing, coming in these glorious gowns and whatnot. It's a very different character. Even though Doris Day's character in this thing, she is an international recording star. It does feel like, it's Doris Day as an international recording star.
Yeah, and Kim Novak in Vertigo, who that's the gray suit. Immediately when I saw Doris Day in that, I thought, oh my God, Vertigo. But she is also kind of a, femme fatale, mysterious woman. So you're going to portray her, I think, more willingly that way in a film as well.
Yeah. So do we think that the film actually benefits from having Doris Day in this? Like, if it was Grace Kelly, would it have been the same? I don't know if it would have been. I think Hitchcock would have let his own sort of gaze kind of factor into that character's presentation on screen. I think just talking it through here, it just makes me think, oh yeah, actually Doris Day is kind of perfect for this part. I am really glad that she's here rather than the other kind of actresses he might have sought out for it.
Well, I will ask the question I don't know the answer to. Does Grace Kelly sing?
I think, doesn't she sing in the movie The Country Girl? The movie she won the Oscar?
I think she sings in, she's in that film with Louis Armstrong and Frank Sinatra. Is it Bing Crosby's in it too? Oh, what's it called?
I'll let that bug you for a little bit now.
Yeah.
I know. I'm going to have to look this up because it is... High Society. That's it.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. I am curious, like, if you had Grace Kelly in your lead, would you be writing that character to even be a singer, or it would be something else? Like maybe she's a fashion model or an actress or something like that. And that would very much affect the outcome of the movie because you obviously have the Que Sera Sera and a lot of the singing stuff, and you wouldn't have that with Grace Kelly. So I don't know. And we're talking a lot about Doris Day and how important she is to this movie. Should they have changed the title? Does the title not work, given how prominent she is?
The woman who knew too much.
That would probably have been more apt. It is still, oh gosh, I can't remember in the original now. Louis Bernard's sort of dying words in the original, are they whispered to Edna Best or Leslie Banks? I can't remember. Here it's to James Stewart, obviously, isn't it? So he's the one sort of passed on that crucial bit of information.
He died. The spy dies in the mother's arms,
right?
but I believe then he goes to his. How does he find the?
No, Jimmy Stewart runs over to the spy, and that's because the makeup smears off in his face, right?
Yes.
No, that's in this version.
Oh, in the original. Yeah.
I know he dies in her because his last words are like, "Oh, sorry, pardon me," and then sort of dies in a very British way, which I still think is terrific.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
That whole kind of, a couple meeting like a friend abroad sort of, I thought that was handled much better here. Like the whole meeting the guy on the bus as opposed to the skiing accident, I guess is what we can call it from the original.
Look, Calvin, I've met some of my best friends witnessing skiing accidents. That's how Scott and I met.
Yeah, I was just slowly dying on him saying, "Oh bother."
Start a podcast with me. Give me a will to live.
Well, Cam, what about you? Like something that you haven't mentioned that you liked about it?
Well, I think we should really look at that Albert Hall sequence because that is like the centerpiece. And there's a few really strong centerpieces in the movie, or set pieces, I should say. We repeat the church with the whispering going on and the singing out loud dialogue. I think it's done a little better here with the post, with the characters behind it. But that Albert Hall sequence is just unbelievable. And I really do like the version of it in the original. I think it's very well done there. But the way they build it up here, I think, is just more effective. They set up, I think, the music cue a little better for the audience, where they, play it a couple times. And the music is, I think, more distinct in this film than the original. Like, it really does stand out to me.
Well, it's been worked on. The score is the musical piece is still the same, but there's a large choir this time instead of a solo female singer, so it has a lot more dramatic effect just having a whole choir there.
Yeah, like it's very operatic, and so I think just like dramatically, it makes the scene come much more to life, and I'm more tracking where the progression of the music is going than the original.
And you've also got like the James Stewart character also trying to get to the assassin, whereas in the original, I believe at this point the father is locked up in the house.
Yeah. And I think like just dramatically it works much better because this music is very operatic. And you also have Doris Day having this internal struggle between saving her child and not doing anything versus stopping the assassination. And it's this push and pull back and forth. It's all playing out in her on her face. No dialogue whatsoever, and just the music. And you have Bernard Herrmann, who's actually acting in the film, leading the orchestra. And it just like the combination of the way he's shooting all the music sequences looks incredible. But then like Doris Day's performance. And when you build to that big crescendo and Jimmy Stewart like storming in the assassin going over the balcony, it's just like you could show those 12 minutes just over and over on YouTube. Like that's the sort of thing I could just watch in isolation happily.
Yeah, it just it's almost like a music video for that Storm Clouds Break, I think, or When the Storm Clouds Broke. It's something like that.
Yeah.
That piece of music. Yeah. It's saying a lot that Bernard Herrmann did like that original piece of music, which was, I believe, composed specifically for the first film.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and he liked it so much that to just repurpose it here, obviously expand it out, and I think it I think the reorchestration, whatever it is, I don't know the technical terms, but whatever he did to it, it just elevates the whole thing, and just how it's timed with the sequence as well. I think as you pointed out, having James Stewart's character actually coming in looking for the assassin, like that gives it some agency. They're trying to get the ushers involved and trying to convince people, but we don't actually hear it, we just see them. Acting is really great. And Doris Day's scream is fantastic, like comparing it to again the original, and just like it's like goosebumps kind of moment. It's fantastic. I love some of the shots as well, like when there's a really great shot, and it looks like a trick shot or a special effect shot or something. It's when it's of the assassin and he's got the gun like directly in front of him. It's like super close up, but everything's in focus. I don't know if they just used a particular lens for it or what. It looks like there's some kind of weird perspective thing going on, but I don't think there is. I think they might have just had a particular lens which had a really great focus on it or something, but it's just such a striking image when you have the choir coming in at that moment as well. I think it's beautifully done.
Yeah, that's a wonderful shot, and also there's a shot of the Luger pistol slowly revealing itself behind the red curtain, and it's almost as if it's like on a table. It's perfectly balanced, and the tip of the gun's just slowly poking out. I mean, that's a GIF right there. If anyone's ever made that, if not, I'll probably make one for when we release this episode because it's a wonderful shot. I kind of went for my that I hadn't mentioned. It's actually kind of an obscure one because I could get into other great things. I mean, the locations are wonderful in this film. I think the performances of some of the other people were also great. But one thing I picked up on is the use of sound in this
Mm.
film, and it's something that struck me in my second viewing. But I don't know if this is a Hitchcock trope. I've only seen a few Hitchcock films. You guys are the experts, but he's playing with sound a lot. You've got some wonderful moments where like people are whispering and you can't hear it as the audience. You have to try and figure out what they're saying, and it's all mumble. There's scenes where in the church, for instance, where I believe the late Lucy Drayton, played by Brenda de Banzie, is mouthing something to her colleague, but you're not allowed to know what that is. There's a phone call that the parents receive in the airport that's drowned out by an aeroplane landing, and all you can see is them sort of breaking down. And it's just wow. And also the footsteps going into the taxidermist, and it's sort of building tension with that. It's all just playing with sound, and I just think that's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, completely agree. It's it's like masterful. I think I read somewhere, I can't remember exactly where it was, where it talked about like Bernard Herrmann's obviously the composer. He's doing the score here. The score's actually used quite sparingly throughout the film. I can't remember exactly what the figures were, but I think they said it was like far less than most or indeed all other Herrmann Hitchcock collaborations. And I think perhaps a part of that is to kind of give that Albert Hall sequence, like that 12-minute, like that is you really build to that because the music is so sparingly used throughout the film. Because there are sequences like I think when Bernard is being chased through the streets, that's all. I think that's unscored. It's unscored until he gets stabbed in the back, I think.
I think you're right.
Yeah. And stuff like that, like, action moments like that, you would think maybe would have more of a score. I think, most of the opening kind of just plays to ambient noises of the market, and then I think the music kicks in quite nicely when the assassin comes to the hotel door and he sees Bernard at the back, and then the bit of music comes in there. So I think it's used very sparingly, which is great because it means that the sound effects can really shine through a lot of sequences.
I think too in the original wasn't the score like there was no score except for the music at the Albert Hall. I think in the original
you get some music in the beginning when you're played in, like a title card, and then Albert Hall, and then the sort of credit sequence. That's it.
Right. Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I liked how much of this movie, as you said, like Scott, there's a lot of scenes that just rely on just you observing the behavior of the actors without the dialogue being audible. And you mentioned Brenda de Banzie, who plays Lucy Drayton. There's that whole sequence in the church where she's communicating with her husband that Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day are in the room and he can't see them. And it's all played out silently from her. And I think she does a lot of fantastic work just silently. A lot of the internal struggle she's going through with, having kidnapped this child is just playing out just through her non-verbally. And I think it's one of the really strong performances in the movie that probably gets overshadowed by the two leads. And just the fact she's not a full-on villain, so we don't tend to think of her that strongly when we think of Hitchcock villains.
Yeah, I think she's probably the only one of the ones that actually gets sort of a switcheroo towards the end. She actually helps out and helps the child get away, which is a nice turn because you kind of feel sorry for her when they get the order to kill the child because she reacts she's so against it. And then you worry that she's still going to go through with it, and you see them in the henchman in the bottom downstairs with the rope ready to kill the kid.
That seems rather extreme.
Yeah, there's other ways of doing it. I just think, that's a bit grim.
It is kind of nice, like it plays into that. It's a married couple versus a married couple. I know that the Draytons are, they are pawns kind of in a much larger scheme, but ultimately it feels like it does really come down to that. And again, it's like it's subtext stuff. We know nothing about the Draytons' like relationship, if they're even in love, or if this is just a marriage, or if they're code names, or like whatever for this mission. But there's no illusions of them having children themselves or anything like that. And I think that a part of Lucy Drayton's thing is, she does genuinely like this kid and she doesn't want to harm a kid. And I think it kind of plays into like, oh, maybe they didn't have, maybe they didn't have kids or couldn't have kids or whatever. Or, I think there's maybe something going on there, which is interesting to read into. But yeah, it's interesting. It's a very much a choice to make, to not just have like your James Mason villain who is very much, and they do have, there's that guy at the some dignitary at the embassy at the end who is very much like above them in terms of the pecking order. So you would think that he would be the main villain in the way that James Mason is in North by Northwest, but they stick with the Draytons, and I have to believe it is because of that married couple v married couple element.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Agents, we have some breaking intel.
That's right. Independent podcasting is not cheap. Equipment, hosting, research, these all add up, and we don't have Vesper Lind to bail us out.
And also, we don't want to run ads on the show. Leave the shopping to Harry Palmer, we say. And this is a big reason we created the Spy Hards Patreon.
So we're here to ask for your help. Please consider joining the Patreon. You'll not only be gaining access to our exclusive lineup of reviews and film commentaries, but also helping support the show. We're currently saving to upgrade our sound equipment to meet IMF standards and give you an even better listening experience.
With a wide range of flexible options and an ever-growing catalogue to dive into, become a true Spy Hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards, or you can find a link in the show notes below. Now, Cam, resume the spy jinx. Well, I think I'll pivot us over to things that maybe we didn't necessarily like with the film. I think you guys have basically said it's a masterpiece, so you haven't got anything. So I guess I'll just sort of talk for 15 minutes.
I would say, Rear Window is a masterpiece. I don't know that this film is on that level, but I think it's pretty terrific.
Okay. Well, I'll go to Calvin first. You're the guest. Is there something that maybe didn't like about the film?
I think me and Cam are on very similar wavelengths with this, because I'm very, like, I don't think this would eke into my top 10 Hitchcock films, but I don't think it's a masterpiece as such, but I do really enjoy it and love it, and I think it's great. Most of it I do love. I already sort of touched upon the rear projection stuff, which I know is a bit quibbly. But for the positive things that I just said about the Draytons, the lack of I think a really good villain, a Peter Lorre, kind of like a standout, is to the film's detriment. Maybe it just means that climax has I don't really feel anything when Mr. Drayton is pushed down the stairs and shoots himself. Like I do with Peter Lorre anyway in the original. They do have the actor, I think his name is Reggie Nalder, who plays the assassin. And I think this clearly, even though I know that Peter Lorre wasn't the assassin in the original, I think that he's very much cast as the, the odd physical type. It's similar to Peter Lorre. He has some unusual features which, when lit and act in the right way, can make him look quite villainous and eerie. I think he's leaning into that, but I don't think he's here enough to make that much of an impression.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's tough because the film is 2 hours, so you got to think, where are you going to put more stuff in for a full villain plot? But then I also think the middle bit sags, so maybe you swap some of that around to build up your villain. I don't know. I'm not Alfred Hitchcock. But yeah, I definitely do agree. I think it is lacking that striking image of Peter Lorre, even if it's not so visually striking, but just someone who you could follow through and understand what they were trying to do. Now, by the end, it's some sort of plot to overthrow the leader of a country from the ambassador, something. It's not very well explained, but you almost kind of want that operator that's fighting against your couple, and you watch him as like a POV character for some of the film, like you did Peter Lorre. But that's just me. Cam, have you got any sort of quibbles?
Well, I wanted to touch on the Draytons there as the villains too, and that I think in one way they fix a problem with the original, but then introduce a problem that I'll mention. We've talked about it, but I'll mention as one of my quibbles. But the thing with the original that I always found a little bit tough was they kidnapped the kid, and you have Peter Lorre in charge of the kid, right? And it didn't make as much sense why he was just so accommodating. Like, Peter Lorre played him as very creepy and sinister, and then was like, oh no, we love this child. Just keep the child safe and all that. Versus, like, here, I think having the Draytons, I understand more of why the kid is okay. Like, there's not this, like, looming threat, so you are more shocked when they are going to execute the kid, and you can see that, both the Draytons are not necessarily on board with this. So I think in terms of just, like, supporting the kidnapping plot, it works having them like this. But the other thing is, it does take away from the finale, because Peter Lorre shooting himself behind a door is pretty memorable versus, an older gentleman tripping and falling down the stairs. It robs the film of a big climactic moment, and I think that's something that Hitchcock is very good at. And I think the button he has for the movie of them walking back into the hotel room and seeing their friends is really funny and really works for me as just a perfect out. But in terms of that big climactic moment, it is not Mount Rushmore. It is not, one of the big finales of a Hitchcock movie you remember. I think I've seen this movie probably 4 times, and I generally don't remember as much the finale being, Ben Drayton tripping down the stairs. Every time I'm like, oh, right, yeah, because it just doesn't stick with you. It's like, looking at, the Bond movies, the villain death in For Your Eyes Only versus, like, Goldfinger going out the window of that plane. It's like, oh, yeah, how did Julian Glover die? Oh, right, Switchblade. Right, okay. That's kind of how I feel about the Draytons.
Yeah, no, I particularly when you have the Albert Hall sequence, which is such a standout and such like this is such a masterful sort of 12 minutes to kind of what you mean? There's another 10-15 minutes of movie after that? Like it can't possibly hit that peak again, so it does just feel like it kind of trickles. I do agree. I do like the button at the end where they walk in on the theatre friends that have been hanging around all day and they're all sleeping and stuff. I think that's one of the better ones, because it is another one of my little Hitchcock pet peeves. Like, he doesn't like to have like a landing scene at the end. Like, he famously really didn't like that whole psychiatrist bit at the end of Psycho because he felt like it over-explained the audience. But maybe this is just me being conditioned to expect, a scene at the end of every film that is just kind of like wrapping things up and everything's okay, whereas Hitchcock very much just like, I think of North by Northwest, where it's really just like out of there, like, that train sequence, it just, you're out before you even have time to process that it's over. But I think this one works quite well.
And another quibble I had was just the child performance by Christopher Olsen playing Hank. I don't blame the child actor. This is so much of that era. As someone who watches a lot of classic Disney stuff as well, this is what child performances were in 1950s movies, but it's a little too precocious for me. It's a bit much.
I actually didn't really bump on the kid too much. I thought it was quite endearing in the coach at the start. Maybe asked a few too many questions, but that's probably why I haven't got kids.
Like, gee willikers, Dad. I don't know. I find it a little too Hollywood kiddie for me.
Looks like Nevada to me.
How are we comparing against Nova Pillbeam? Are we going to have a ranking of the man who knew too much children?
Oh,
I think Nova takes the prize. I think she's better. I think so.
I think she's in a story framework. She's a bit cuter. So you kind of want her to be safe, maybe a bit more than the boy in the remake. I'm not saying I want him to meet the end that was going to meet him at the bottom of the stairs.
That's very dark, Scott. Very dark.
You're going in there with the rope yourself.
That's the alternate version of the film with the shotgun. Yeah. I'll be in there.
To be fair to the kid, too, like, Christopher Olsen has to do a lot more than Nova did in the original. Like, he has to have big emotional moments where he's breaking down crying and stuff like that. And again, it's more of a 1950s acting style and a way they approach child performances that doesn't work for me as much as what he's actually doing. He's probably just fine as a child actor.
And to be fair, he can whistle very well and dance and sing.
Yeah, no kidding. If I were a child and they locked me up and were like, whistle as loud as you can, and it would be like...
Cam, can you hear us? Guess he's dead. I've already sort of said all of my quibbles. I will just quickly dash back to that little group of friends, the showbiz friends. not to poo-poo them anymore. I know, Calvin, you're a fan. But what
Me
I did
too.
find... I don't really care about you, Cam.
I'm
sorry.
there with those friends. I am just hanging out with them.
The only thing I found cool just looking them up was one of them is played by Hilary Brooke, who people who have listening along will know she's the lady who leads the seance in Ministry of Fear.
Oh my god. Really?
Mm-hmm.
I did not make that connection. Wow. Awesome, Scott.
That's me doing my IMDb research right there. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, I think before we mosey on up and tackle the knock list, let's just go with any final notes. I have a couple of quick notes, but I'll throw it out to everyone else first. Calvin, anything left for us?
I guess just to say a little bit, because we spent a lot of time talking about Doris Day. I guess just to comment on James Stewart's, his own performance, because I do really like him. I think he's a really great lead, and I think he's really good in some. Like, I think Doris Day obviously has the more dramatic stuff to work with.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's given a bit more kind of affable everyman stuff, which is in a lot of ways part of his usual routine. He's the one sort of fumbling around at the restaurant and with the taxidermists and all that kind of stuff. He's clambering out of the church by climbing the rope up to the bell and all that kind of stuff. He is quite even when he's in sort of like action mode, like trying to find the guy at the Albert Hall sequence, there is still something a little bit comedic and unlikely hero about him, which I think is really nice and I think works to the film's better. Probably not my favorite, probably my least favorite performance of his in all of his 4 Hitchcock films. But even then, I still really love him in it.
And I liked the scene where they're having like the meal. I like the kind of the travelogue stuff they do here.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they're like kind of showing Morocco, and you're always a little worried that it's going to be like that 1950s, approach to a foreign culture where you're like, oh boy. And I like that it was portrayed as more just kind of naive and small town and trying to understand it and actually asking questions. Because they're actually asking the Draytons, like, oh, why is it done this way? And, is it religious or is it, social? He's like, no, it's more social. And, like, they're actually asking those questions versus just like, yeehaw, what's this all about? The kind of the stuff you would see in so many movies. Like, so many movies of this era and going into the next preceding decades, they would play it much more overtly comedic.
Well, I also really love the sort of the waiter in the restaurant who sees James Stewart using his other hand, just walks up and just shakes his head at him. Just no, we don't do that here.
Yeah.
Cam, do you have any final notes?
Well, I wanted to just ask the two of you because I mentioned it. What did you think of this version of the church sequence in comparison to the original one?
There was no chairs being thrown.
True.
So I was bitterly disappointed.
That was the first thing that came to my mind as well. I guess I guess it doesn't move the dial for me much in either film. I guess I prefer the remake. I think there's a bit more suspense to it. Yeah, is it one of your favorite scenes in both of them, Cam, or do you have like a distinct preference?
It's not one of my favorite sequences, no, but it's one I think is probably more effective here because you have, Ben Drayton's inability, or I think, Edward Drayton. I've been calling him Ben. I don't know where I got Ben from. It's Edward Drayton. But you have his inability to see them in the room, which I think adds to the suspense. The lack of chair throwing is sad, but at the same time, do I want to see Jimmy Stewart hurling chairs at, Bernard Miles as Edward Drayton? Like, I feel like it's not as much of a physical fight.
Yes, you do. The answer is always yes.
I think one thing that improves it hugely is the fact that you have him and Doris Day together versus that random uncle that showed up in the original.
Yeah, the bumbling uncle had a sore tooth.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely lacking a scene in the dentist office, I'll tell you that. I suppose for my final notes, I have a couple of questions, but one interesting observation I made first, and it's a Bond connection for you. So I believe it's Quantum of Solace, Calvin will correct me, where there's a chap in the background with a broom that's sweeping the air.
Oh, yes.
pay attention during the Royal Albert Hall performance. That if you look to the chap next to the guy with the cymbals, there's a guy playing very large drums. He's not even touching the drums. He's just sort of hitting the air above them. It's obvious as well. Like, it's as bad as The Broom. I had to go back and watch it a couple of times and had a riot laughing at this guy just pretending to hit the drums but missing completely. And these are big drums. These are like the size of a table.
I wondered if that was an orchestra thing, like if it wasn't like his drums that were playing in that moment, but he was doing it to keep time with the rest of the thing. But then you can hear drums as he's like in time with him not hitting them, which is really distracting.
It's like the equivalent of like if you go, I don't know, to a church, maybe you go to a wedding or something in a church, but you don't want to sing, so you just sort of mouth the words. You don't actually sing anything. I just had a good laugh at that.
Well, I'm now curious. What would be the reasons they wouldn't have him hitting the drums?
They don't want the sound to be created whilst they're filming.
But they're like filming musical sscenes.
Well, they wouldn't be constantly playing the orchestra. That moment was about capturing the sound of the cymbals, so you wouldn't want the reverberation from the drums.
Right.
Because that you need to silence that. You need to put your hands on it to stop it, because they're big old drums. So you don't want to hit them, so the percussion's not be made.
Okay, that's fair.
That's the technical answer. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that, because I was wondering like what would be the reasons for that. But yeah, that makes as much sense as anything.
But speaking of the cymbals, I have to ask, because this chap is basically standing up for the entire performance until his final moment of glory. Is the cymbal player the worst job in an orchestra?
Okay, I was wondering the same thing. Is it worst or best? Like,
well,
if you are the cymbal player, and does it take training? Is it difficult to become a cymbal player? Because
hot
this
take
guy
from
would
Cam,
indicate
cymbal players, no training.
I'm sure the cymbal players union is going to be sending me angry letters. But like, do you get paid the same amount as other players? Like, how does this work for the cymbal? And is it the same for like a triangle player? Are you on par with like a cymbal player?
Punching down today, aren't we, Cam?
Well, I was someone who was trained on the triangle in school, so I can relate to any triangle players out there.
All I can say is it takes precision timing.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what the pay scale is. I've never played in a full orchestra before, so I don't know.
It does seem unfair.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Like the first chair violinist, they've got a Stradivarius, they've got like the best violin in the world, and they are carrying the entire performance. And then there's one guy at the back just going, drum, drum, drum. I don't know.
If I'm a cymbal player and I'm like sick and can't make it to the show, do they care?
Who gets bumped like down to cymbal player? Who's the next on the cutting line? If like the cymbal player hasn't turned up, who's getting demoted?
Well, okay, now I'm wondering if the cymbal player in a typical orchestra would be kind of a multi-instrumentalist, where they have a few of those types of jobs, like a triangle,
that is usually,
cymbals,
yes.
and a couple other things.
That is usually the answer to that question, yes. That's the boring answer, sorry. I was just playing along.
Or maybe, like, we're only seeing one song here, so the next one in the set list, he might be like going like one of those monkey wind-up dolls. Like the next song is going to be a complete cymbal lead. Just
think of all the lives of American families that performance would ruin.
He pulls out an electric guitar for the next song.
Well, that's a different life ruined. Well, gents, I think we have arrived at our destination, knock list time. Calvin, last time you joined us, you spoke about Goldfinger, and that made the knock list. My question to you, sir, is does The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1956 make the knock list?
Certainly does for me, yeah. It's not even an on-the-line thing. I think it's quite a firm, fun bit of espionage, spy, thriller, entertainment. It's certainly not the first film that I would recommend people seek out when it comes to Hitchcock. I think there's much better spy stuff in his filmography. But I think for what this is, it's a really solid piece of entertainment. And if you're getting into Hitchcock, if you like North by Northwest, if you like Rear Window, this is of that ilk. I think that is a nice kind of maybe not. Maybe not complete virgin introduction into Hitchcock, but certainly I think it's one of the, if you're only going to give like 10 a go, this should be in there.
Okay, so that's a firm yes. Cam, what have you got?
I'm a yes as well for this one. And I think when you're looking at this particular era, like this is an astonishing era for Hitchcock. So I think this one often gets diminished a little bit just by comparisons to, your Rear Windows and your Psychos and whatever else. But I think in terms of his espionage stuff, this is like upper tier for me. Like North by Northwest, it really is very high. Same with Notorious. But I think this one is, just kind of under that tier, because the thing is, we have other Hitchcocks that we'll be doing in the future, and there's at least a couple that I'm like, ugh, not looking too forward to revisiting those. So to me, like, if you're looking at like the examples of very good Hitchcock espionage stories, this one definitely is on the list.
Well, it's that magic combination of having a guest and us two where my vote becomes useless. So I guess I'll retire from podcasting. No, I look at the ones that are on the list for Hitchcock, and I think every Hitchcock we've done so far has made the knock list, Cam?
With the exception of the original version of this.
Of course. Yes, you're right. Thank you. I don't think this film is on par with The 39 Steps, Notorious, or North by Northwest. I think it is a very good film. I'm not sure it would be a must-see. And so I'm going to go with no. Doesn't matter.
It is your You Only Live Twice.
Yes, I finally get it. You Only Live Twice. There we go. This is the hill I'd rather die on.
Okay, fair.
The volcano.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I really loved some bits of this. I loved Doris Day in this. I mean, I love Doris Day and Calamity Jane, but this is, a great film. And I love a lot of what Hitchcock did with this film, but I just don't think I would put this in the list of things you needed to see when it comes to Hitchcock spy films, which then worries me with what you said, Cam, about other Hitchcock spy films we've got coming down the road.
There's one I'm thinking of, and I think Calvin will probably be able to read my mind on this. That's decade plus past this one, that is unbelievable to have to sit through. Like I'm terrified to revisit it. I've only watched it once. Do you know the one, Calvin, I'm thinking of?
I think I do. Do you want me to? I won't say
I'll
it.
keep it surprised because I want to be surprised by it.
Yeah.
I think I know exactly which one you mean, and I have also only seen it once.
Maybe that's your return.
Oh God. It's like I've had this Hitchcock Blu-ray set for like 10 years now. It's the one disc that has never come out.
Wow. Okay, that's bad. It's bad that Cam wouldn't go back either. To be fair, he loves a bit of Hitchcock.
Yeah.
But I am curious before we wrap up. This film has made the knock list. Of the two versions of this film, it's the only version to make the knock list. But just a quick discussion about which we think is the best version. I suppose is probably the one that's on the knock list. But just a chat, maybe comparing the two and everyone's thoughts. So, Calvin, just between the two, is this your favorite?
Yeah, easily a favorite. I think that the originals are interesting. Like just to talk about, if you do sort of recommend Hitchcock films to people, how high up do they go? I think that the original is kind of that's one that you go to when you're fully settled in, when you're familiar with Hitchcock. It's not like oh my God, you need to see this as an example of his brilliance. I think it might be more of a academic sort of exercise. That's not to say I don't enjoy it. I certainly enjoy it, but not up to the caliber of this. It has brevity in its favor, I suppose, because it is like, what is it, 80 minutes long, something like that? I know it's not even an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So it has that working for it. But this just expands on it. It's got so much more character, so much more life. The first one I think is interesting technically. I think you can really see that they're just trying to work these characters into these situations so that they have an excuse to do this sequence that Hitchcock really wants to do, whereas it just feels so much more organic in the original. Remake.
There's also like quite a bit more grit to the original. Like 1950s Hollywood is just more of a safer decade. And in that original, you have that big shootout with some really dark humor. there's maybe a little more violence to that original one that I think for certain people who would prefer a bit of a darker take on the material, that's the version to watch. It's just like for me, I don't really come down one way or the other on whether I'm watching the 50s Hollywood version versus the grittier British version. It's more, to me, the character issues and how much you're keeping me going throughout. And the problem with that original for me is you just really lose threads of just narratively what's going on with your characters, and they're not playing any sort of active role in a finale, which just doesn't work the same way that I think this one does.
I think that's fair. I think if I was asked the question to pick one, I think this film is the better of the two films. I think it's hard to make an argument otherwise, but I do enjoy a lot of the quirkiness of the original. Okay, it's mostly the chair throwing. That's all I'm there for.
I mean, the shootout at the end is technically brilliant. It's just that you're losing your lead characters aren't doing anything until the wife with the gun at the very end. So that's why it feels more just kind of weird. But on a technical level, I could happily sit and revisit that sequence.
Well, I think that about wraps us up. And so we've had 2 yeses and a no. And as such, The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1956 is making the knock list. Now, before we talk about what we're doing next week, Calvin, thank you, sir, for making your triumphant return to the Crash of a Cymbal.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. Honestly, anytime, it's always a joy. So thank you very much. I love this podcast, so it's always just a delight to be here on it.
Well, thank you, sir. Now, I mean, we've had you on for a Bond, we've had you on for a Hitchcock. You made the call last time. You wanted to do a Hitchcock. What's your call this time? Do you want to do something, neither of those things, or do you want to go back to Bond? What would you like to do?
Oh God.
No promises, but I'd like to hear.
Both at the same time.
That's a film.
Yeah. You know what? I'm game for anything. Like I say, I just love being here. So yeah, Hitchcock, Bond.
So you're going to get the 8th, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. TV film next time you come tonight.
Oh,
or something like that. And he retracts his statement there.
Or that Hitchcock film I was alluding to earlier, yes.
No, I think I might have something perfect in mind for you, Calvin. But other than that, we didn't really introduce you too well at the start. But for those who don't know you that well, where can they find more from you?
Oh, yeah, you can find me on YouTube. If you just search Calvin Dyson, you'll find my channel. That's Calvin with a C, Dyson, like the vacuum cleaner. And yeah, I make videos primarily about Bond-related things, films, TV, books, video games, all that kind of stuff. And then occasionally we'll touch on other spy media and sort of mini reviews. So yeah, do head over to YouTube.
We'll obviously have a link in the show notes below so you can go directly to that. Recently, Calvin, you brought out the pinnacle of No Time to Die retrospectives, I would say.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it took a long time. It's almost as long as the film.
Yeah, it's very close to the runtime, but I mean, you really do go in depth, and also it's funny, which is kind of what I want from a review.
Thank
like
you.
That. Probably funnier than the film it's based on.
Oh, that's a compliment. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. But what have you got in the pipeline, and you can sort of spoil for us here?
Oh gosh, a lot of ranking videos now actually, which I don't know if that makes people kind of roll their eyes. But now that No Time to Die is kind of out in the wild, it's like, oh yeah, now I can finally start ranking villains and Bond women, all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
I would strongly recommend people check out your rankings of the different decades trailers. The way they promoted those films with their teasers and trailers. I found that fascinating. And some of the footage they would just shoot for those trailers and teasers, I loved it. I loved every second of it.
Oh, I love it when they do things like that, and thank you very much. But when they, in fact, they with Hitchcock films a lot of actually they do. There's some of the trailers very interesting. I don't know if you saw the one for this, but it's James Stewart coming out and addressing the audience and sort of saying, "Well, me and my wife went to Marrakesh, and then we came to London," and it's just kind of like talks you through it. It's really interesting. But yes, anyway, thank you. Those videos were really fun to do, so thank you for that.
Well, I think before we talk about the film, I guess, listeners, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out Calvin's channel because it's got our stamp of approval. But Calvin, thank you for joining us once again.
No, thank you very much. It's, as I say, it's a pleasure. Always love it. So yeah, thank you.
Well, Cam, the question is, what are we doing next week?
A little bit of a change of pace, Scott. We are tackling the 2006 Paul Verhoeven film, Black Book.
I don't know much about this film, but what I do know is it is our first foreign language film.
Correct. Yeah, we've got quite a few to cover, but for some reason we haven't done one up until now. But this will remedy that.
It's probably due to our lack of grasp of English, let alone any other language.
Probably. I was an English major, but...
No, I'm more of an English minor myself.
Oh, fair enough.
Well, there you go, folks. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to watch Black Book from 2006 and join us next week. Now, The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1956 did make the knock list. If you want to find out more films that also made the list, you can find us on letterboxd.com/spyhards. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at spyhards. That's SPYHARDS on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, if you're ever feeling down, I always recommend singing Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be.
Hello, my name is Chris Carr, I'm a filmmaker and podcaster. Join me as I take a look at the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics and organised crime on my podcast, Secrets and Spies, available on all podcast apps.
This is manna from spy heaven.